what we need.
Cut the crap in the greed. Give this nation what we need.
Cut the crap and the greed. Give this nation what we need.
No justice.
No peace.
No justice.
No peace.
No justice.
No peace.
If we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace.
If we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace.
I said if we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace.
If we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace.
All right. Are we angry? You know what you can do when you're angry? You can sing. So I'm going to teach you something. Can I teach you something real quick? All right. All you got to do is sing, "You oughta know." So I'll do 1, 2, 3, and then you ought to know. 1, 2, 3, you ought to know. Again, 1, 2, 3, you ought to know. All right, now for this song, you sing that 4 times. Ready? 1, 2, 3, you ought to know. 2, wait. You ought to know. Wait. You ought to know. You do it 4 times for each verse, all right? This song is called Rules for Radicals. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. You ought to know what's going on. You ought to know how fear gains traction. You ought to know where the truth has gone. You ought to know this is all a distraction. Good. From the way they're robbing us blind, and the way they destroy our minds with the fairground show. You really ought to know. Second verse. You ought to know when a friend is hurting. You ought to know when something's obscene. You ought to know when they draw the curtain. You ought to know they don't want to be seen. But when the darkness is closing in, and you can't see where you've been or where you're gonna go, you really ought to know. Here we go. You ought to know how to figure it out. You ought to know not to fall in love. You ought to know how to do without. You ought to know when push comes to shove, that they're gonna separate you and teach your children how to hate you, 'cause that's how it goes. You really ought to know. Now, to paraphrase Arlo Guthrie, if you want to end fascism, corruption, and all that kind of stuff, you got to sing loud. We got one last verse. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. You ought to know the sound of weeping. You ought to know not to be proud. You ought to know you shouldn't be sleeping. You ought to know that's not allowed. Until they recognize our existence, you got to keep kicking with resistance until we overthrow. You really ought to know. You really ought to know. You really ought to know. Thank y'all.